Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to GRIPS Forum. My name is Yoko Iwama, Professor of the National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies, GRIPS. I will be serving as a moderator today. GRIPS Forum aims at informing policy debates by inviting leaders in various fields. It is a public event and at the same time gives our students opportunities to join and benefit from the lectures and discussions. Today, we will think together this demographic transition and economic growth in Asia, lessons from Japan's experience, with a wonderful speaker, Professor Sagiri Kitao. Today's lecture examines the challenges of demographic transition and macroeconomic growth that many Asian countries are beginning to face, drawing on Japanese experience as a forerunner of aging demographics. It analyzes the impacts of population aging on fiscal sustainability, labor markets, and consumption patterns, and discusses the importance of social security design, promoting labor force participation among older adults and women, and investment in education and reskilling. The lecture offers policy recommendations based on Japan's lessons, aiming for a balance between growth and equity. So let me introduce today's lecturer, Professor Kitao. She is Professor of Economics at National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies. Her research area is macroeconomics, and she specializes in quantitative analysis of public policies such as tax and social security system, using macroeconomic models with heterogeneous households. She worked at Goldman Sachs, University of Southern California, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, and the University of Tokyo before assuming her current position in 2024. She holds a Master of Public Administration, International Development from Harvard University and a PhD in Economics from New York University. So let us welcome Professor Sagiri Kitao. She will speak about demographic transition and economic growth in Asia, lessons from Japan's experience. We will have 40 to 45 minutes of Professor Kitao's talk, and then we will have panel discussions with GRIPS experts and students. Then we will have open Q&A sessions with the wider audience, and you are welcome to speak up by presenting the raise hand button or putting your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom screen. So Professor Kitao, the floor is yours.
Okay, so thank you very much, Professor Iwama, for a very kind introduction. And I'm very delighted to have this opportunity to speak to a lot of people from GRIPS and GRIPS alumni, and then also from Japan and abroad. So let me share the screen and let's start. Okay, so let me know if there's any issue with the screen. So as Professor Iwama kindly introduced, I've been working on the macroeconomic issues recently, focusing more on the demographic issues in Japan and the region. So as you know, Japan has been undergoing a huge change in the demographic structure. So these pictures show the demographic pyramids, just showing the number of people by age. From the bottom 0-year-old all the way to 110. So back in 1960s, the demographic structure in Japan looked nice and healthy, a lot of young people. But by 1990, the pyramids started to look a little shaky. The peak of the age distribution was in the 40s, so that those are the people who were born right after the World War II. And the second peak is the second baby boomers around age 15. And then we thought the third baby boom must be coming soon, but waiting until 2025, we didn't really see that. So now we stand with this very unstable demographic structure. So as you can see, after the peak of people who were born in 1970s, the number of newborns has been declining monotonically. So this is the shape in Japan. What about other countries in Asia? So let's look at some countries, Philippines, India, and Thailand. So the pictures of the Philippines and India kind of look like what Japan looked like in 1960s, and Thailand maybe a little shrinking at the bottom, something that looks like a 1990s in Japan. So those countries, are kind of started to experience a decline in the fertility. As you can see, the shrinking bottom, but demographic structure is a lot healthier than in Japan. But what about the future? So it's very difficult to predict what the demographic structure will be. But according to the United Nations projections, this is the picture in 2055. So there's a lot of uncertainty. So there's a shaded area in green and the yellow reflecting the uncertainty, but the baseline projection is this blue line at the bottom. So as you can see, the Philippines and India will look more like maybe Thailand now, and then Thailand will start to look like more like Japan as of now. So it's the demographic aging. Demographic aging is a big issue in Japan, Korea, developed nations, but other Asian countries are very soon to follow. And why does it happen? So it happens because of the decline in the fertility rate. So this picture shows the transition of the total fertility rate, representing the number of children that each woman is expected to have based on the age-specific fertility rate in each year. So as you can see, the Japan's fertility rate declined dramatically, but maybe compared to other countries, the decline seems very moderate. So last week, there was an announcement of the total fertility rate in 2024, and we hit the record low fertility rate of 1.15. So each woman will have just about 1.2 children over the life cycle. And the number of newborns last year was less than 0.7 million, which is also the record low. So I was born in the early 1970s, and I was born in the cohort of about 2 million individuals. So over the last 50 years, the number of babies shrank by about 2/3, which is, astonishing speed of the decline in the number of babies. But other countries, for example, look at the Philippines, total fertility rate declined from above 6 all the way to 2. And Korea, as you probably know, was very fast catching up with Japan. And then now they're exceeding in terms of the speed of the decline in the fertility rate. And their fertility rate is almost 0.7 now. So it's a common problem that we are experiencing. And at the same time, people are living longer and longer. So this picture shows the life expectancy at birth in different countries in Asia. So Japan's life expectancy has been always very high and increasing, but other countries are also very quickly catching up. Korea's life expectancy was 62, but now it's almost 85. So everybody's living, on average, longer and longer, which is a nice thing. But what that implies in terms of the demographic structure is a little worrisome. So if you take the ratio of the people above age 65 to the number of people aged between 20 and 64, let's call it as an old age dependency ratio, that number has been increasing dramatically. So since 2000, Japan's old age dependency ratio, defined this way, was less than 30%. But now it's around 50%. And then by the end of 2050, it's going to reach almost 80%. And again, Korea is very fast in catching up from 10% all the way to 90%. And it means that for each older person, there's only one working age, individual supporting the retirees. So that can cause a big challenge to the economy. So demographic aging, as we saw, it's not just a phenomena facing Japan, but it's a global phenomena, including the growing Asian countries. So I want to think with you today what the economic challenges these demographic trends will impose on us, and then how we can prepare for what to come. And we're going to use Japan as an example of a front runner of this aging economy. And then I want you to learn lessons from our experience. But I'm going to have to tell you that I'm not going to present the set of the solutions that you should take from our experience, because we are still, struggling a lot. And then there are a lot of lessons also failures and success from what we did over the last several decades. So I want you to extract some lessons from our both success and the failures. So mainly I'm going to focus on three issues. First one is about the fiscal challenge. So if we have an increasing number of old people, we tend to have a rising expenditures. If you have the social insurance system that provides a generous benefit for all the people. And then because of the shrinking working age population, which of course is necessary to produce output, that's going to also pose the significant macroeconomic challenges. And then I'm also going to talk about the women's labor force participation issues and the gender gap. And the demographic aging is not just about the fiscal or the macroeconomic issues, but demographic aging affects almost every part of the macroeconomy. So it can affect the consumption structure and the inequality and the issues about the immigration and even monetary policy, which you might consider is just a macroeconomic phenomena, which has nothing to do with the demographic structure. But the recent studies show that the effect of the monetary policy may be subject to the changes in the demographic structure as well. So I'm going to just briefly talk about these issues as well. And then in conclusion, I don't want to end it with the tough faces of the audience. So I try to close the talk with some smiles on your face, focusing on some silver lining of the demographic aging. There must be something positive about the aging demographics. So when I present these issues, I tend to focus on the challenges and the issues and the struggles, but that's not the end of the story. So let's start with the fiscal challenge. So as I mentioned, the old people tend to be costly, especially in an economy where there is, the comprehensive social insurance system that protects the income changes as you retire. So, for example, public pension, health insurance, and long-term care insurance that we have in Japan tend to provide much more benefit for older individuals. So the aging demographic will, increase the per capita government expenditures, especially if these programs are operated on a pay-as-you-go basis rather than a self-financing scheme, meaning that the transfers to the old people are financed at the same time as they collect the taxes or the premiums from the young people. That's called the pay-as-you-go system. Then it can impose significant burden on the economic activities as well. We have to raise taxes from the sources of income, and that would give a disincentive to work. Or if we have to tax on the corporate income, then that will give disincentive for the firms to invest. So that can damage the economic growth. And then, of course, if you have a shrinking young age population who constitute basically the tax base to finance these demographic expenditures, then that can also exacerbate the fiscal burden. So take the example in Japan. So we have a very comprehensive social insurance system, which I appreciate every day. So we have a public pension system that started in 1960s. And that consists of a two-tiered system. So there's a first part of the pension, which is called the basic pension, with the the normal retirement age or the eligibility age to start collecting benefits of 65. And that normal retirement age has not changed ever since the program started in 1960s. And then the second part is the employment-based pension system, which provides benefits that are tied to the contribution that you make. So the normal retirement age for this part has been increasing from age 60 to 65. And then there's also the health insurance system that started in 1960s. And then there's a co-payment, the payment that we have to make out of the total medical expenditures, which decreases in age. So if you're above age 75, you pay only 10% of the medical expenditures and then 90% paid by this health insurance system, which is very nice. I mean, you tend to incur a lot more medical expenditures when you get old, and then the government is going to be very, very helpful. But this implies that there's an increasing cost of the medical expenditures for the government. And then we also started this long-term care insurance since 2000, providing the cares for old people who have difficulties in daily life, which is also very helpful. And this really released a lot of children, especially women, from taking care of their parents, but this also costs a lot. So payment rate for this long-term care is just 10%, meaning that 90% is paid by the government. So there's also the cost. This shows the fiscal cost that represents the payment for these three social insurance programs. So the picture on the left shows the fraction of the GDP allocated to this social insurance expenditures, which was less than 5% back in 1960s, but it increased really quickly to reach almost above 20% of GDP. So that's a huge amount that we have to finance. And then, of course, the government collects the taxes and premiums from people, but that's not enough. So that leads to the increase in the government debt. And as you can see in the picture on the right, the government debt increased from about 50% of GDP to above 250% of GDP. So that's one of the highest amount across all countries, and definitely the highest in the developed countries. And we don't really see how this government debt is going to go down to the normal or healthy level. And I don't also expect these social insurance expenditures will go down anytime soon. So that's the challenges that we are facing. So I have a paper with Minamo Mikoshiba of Nagoya University that tried to simulate how these expenditures are going to change over time, over the coming decades. So assuming the current social insurance systems are going to be maintained, what would be the fiscal burden for the government and the economy? That's the simulation that we did. So starting from 2020, when about 25% of GDP will be spent on these expenditures, according to our predictions and also the projected demographic shift, these expenditures will rise really quickly and then will reach about 40% of above 40% of GDP by 2070 or so. So this amount is huge, and it's clearly not sustainable. If you want to translate that number into, for example, the consumption tax, consumption is about 50%, 60% of GDP. So this amounts to almost like 80% of total consumption, or consumption tax of 80%, which is clearly unacceptable. So I don't think we can propose a tax system that is enough to finance these expenditures, or it's also very difficult to reduce those expenditures right away, as we will discuss later. So these are the challenges that we are facing. And I know that many Asian countries are trying to establish a comprehensive, social safety net, including the public pension and health insurance system, especially for all the individuals whose income tends to be lower. So these are really good things, and I mean the government should do that. But at the same time, you have to be very careful, because once these systems are established, and especially after the demographic aging has already progressed, it's very difficult to reform, especially if you're living in the democratic world. Then it's once the system is there, people are going to behave expecting to receive the benefits from the system. So changing your system to reduce the benefits or increasing burden will be very challenging politically. And if you have an increasing expenditures to provide more benefit, they don't come for free. So you have to collect the taxes, and then that, again, as I mentioned, will give some disincentive for growth. If income tax is higher, then you have lower incentive to work. So that's gonna add to the problem. And then if you don't really know how the rising expenditures are going to be financed, then that will increase the fiscal uncertainty. So if you ask firms or people what kind of uncertainty that you're worried about, lots of people and firms say the fiscal uncertainty, how this rising demographic costs are going to be financed, what the taxes are going to be. So if there's a lot of uncertainty, it's hard to make the investment for the future. So that can lead to the big drag for the economic growth. And I want you to learn from this experience that the social insurance system is very good, but it must be introduced very carefully, and not just about the financing, not just being worried about the financing scheme as of today, but thinking about how the expenditures are going to rise over the next 10 years, or maybe 20 years, or even further. And then more, in a concrete, as some concrete examples, maybe the options are the following. So maybe you can introduce some automatic benefit adjustment scheme in response to the demographic aging. For example, if there's an increase in the longevity and the rise of the number of the pension recipients, or the decline in the number of the people who contribute to the system, you can embed in the system that will automatically adjust the payment, and or maybe adjust the tax scheme. And people should commit to that kind of a forward-looking reform. And also you also have to try to minimize the distortions that will be created by the financing scheme. So, if you have a difficulty in raising enough expenditures, it's easier to say, let's tax on the rich people. If people have, high income, why don't we, increase the tax rate on these people? That's easier to say that. And then it may sound, politically desirable, but at the same time, we have to consider the cost of doing that, because people are going to respond to the tax changes in the tax system. If you have an earnings test, for example, then people may choose not to work that much, or not to invest, or maybe, even try to run away from the country. And then that will, reduce the tax base. So that kind of response must be considered as well. And another option is to use, instead of the pay-as-you-go system, you could introduce a self-financing scheme, so that what you're going to receive is going to be based on what you have contributed. In some countries like Singapore and Australia, they have at least partially self-financing scheme. So that's, that way the government can be free from the risk of the demographic aging. But at the same time, you also have to be careful. There's a trade-off between the efficiency and the redistribution. So if you have a large degree of inequality, this may not work very well, because people who can contribute will do contribute, but people who have low income, or maybe people who are working in the informal sector, may not be able to contribute, and then end up having no saving at all. And eventually the government will have to save, right? So it requires some conditions, some, financial market development, and, some degree of equality across different people. And then people also have to have the financial literacy about how to invest their own saving. So that's the fiscal. And let's move on to the macroeconomic challenges. So if you have a declining working age population and increasing old age dependency ratio, it creates a macroeconomic challenge. So if you have fewer people in the labor market, then of course you need the labor to produce output, and the production capacity is going to decline, and the firms would have to compete over decreasing number of workers. So you would have to increase wages, and then that's going to increase the firm's cost of the production. So that's a simple macroeconomic consequence of the declining working age population. And then at the same time, because of this increase in the rising expenditures to finance the social insurance schemes, you also have to increase the taxes, and then that can also reduce the incentives to consume or invest, and can create the problem in the economic activities. So if these problems are coming from the decline in the fertility rate, why don't we just try to reverse the fertility trend? Right, try to give a lot of money incentives to have more kids, and then if we can somehow reverse the trend of the fertility, then the problem will be resolved. But of course, this is an important issue, and the government should pay a lot of attention to what is obstacle preventing people from having ideal number of children. But it's not easy. For example, many countries, for example, France, Hungary, and the Scandinavian countries, these countries, for example, have long implemented a very comprehensive prenatal policies, and a lot of policies to achieve the balance of family and the work for women, and they have achieved much more equality between the genders. But even those countries are experiencing a rapid decline in the fertility rate, especially since 2010, as you can see in the picture. And if you think about Japan, for example, as we saw in the picture earlier, this decline in the fertility is nothing new. So it's a trend that continued over the last as long as 50 years. And then this happened not just because of the lack of money or the sudden changes, but it happened at the same time as many other things changed in the economy. There was an increase in the education level of men, and especially for women, and women's participation increased. And although we still have a big gender gap, the gender gap narrowed significantly over the past decades. And there was also, the increase in the cost of raising children, and there was a development of the social insurance system. So back in old days, when there was no social security or long-term care, you had to count on kids. So to support your retirement, but we don't need kids now in terms of supporting our retirement, because pensions are provided, and we have a comprehensive health insurance and the long-term care. So all these changes happened at the same time, and then affecting how we decide when to get married and how to formulate our families. So reversing this trend implies we have to undo everything that happened over the last 50 years, essentially, which is not, of course, feasible. So it's important to, try to work on the fertility, but we should not set an optimistic goal, and then we should realize that it may be a very difficult problem to achieve. So we should not just, keep pouring resources, especially when, we have such a severe problem on the fiscal issues. But the positive things is that what we are worried about in terms of the macroeconomy is the labor supply. It's not simply the number of the population, number of the people in the working age, right? So the labor supply is not just a number; it's a labor input that we use for the production. And that can increase even without the increase in the number of people, if there's an increase in, for example, the participation rate. That's first thing. And then if there's a productivity of a worker, let's say by 10%, that has the same effect as the 10% increase in the population. And sometimes I hear people saying that Japan has fewer workers and that they're in trouble. That's not the case. In terms of the number of the workers, it has been actually increasing since 2000, although the population has started to decline already in 2008. And why does that happen? So this picture shows the employment rates in Japan by age. Sorry, men on the left and the women on the right by age. So as you can see, for men always work at the prime age, but as they reach maybe late 50s or 60s, some people start to leave the labor force. But the participation rate, the employment rate of older men increased dramatically over the last 20 years. And that change happened even more for women. So back in 2000, you can see that there's a blip in the labor force participation in their 30s, right? So if once they get married and they have kids, it was more convention that they leave the labor force, staying at home, taking care of kids, and then when kids grow, they come back to the labor market. And then that phenomena called the M-shaped. Here you cannot really see the left end, but the blip has disappeared over the last 20 years. And then the participation rate increased almost universally across all age groups. And although the number of people declined, the participation rate increased. So the number of the worker has actually increased. So that's a good sign. And you might wonder why all the people are working so much more. And if you can mobilize all the people to, stay in the labor force, that can also alleviate the cost of the, the demographic shift. So I have a paper with Nozomi Takeda of the University of Tokyo that builds a model to investigate why, all the people work so much. This is using a so-called a structural macro life cycle model, trying to understand the motivations for people to make certain actions as we see in the data. So it's not really simple. It's because of the combination of lots of factors. So as I mentioned, the normal retirement age to receive the Social Security benefits for the second tier of the pension has actually increased from age 60 to 65 over time. So that also gives this incentive, it's incentive for people to stay in the labor force and then finance, accumulate more saving for retirement. And then there's also decline in the replacement rate of the pension benefits that also gave additional incentive to work. And then as we saw, there has been an increase in the longevity, and then that happened because of the improved health conditions, which enabled older workers to remain in the workforce. At the same time, there has been a shift in the industrial structure from more like agriculture or manufacturing towards more emphasis on the service sector. Especially since 2000, there has been a huge increase in the number of workers demanded in the health and the care service sector, which require relatively less physical strength compared to manufacturing or agriculture. So older people find it relatively easier to stay in the labor force. And at the same time, there was also a shift in the mandatory retirement age. So in Japan, companies can set the mandatory retirement age, which cannot be below 60 now. But now companies are required by the government to offer some employment opportunities until age 65. And then now, firms are also encouraged to do so until age 70. Most likely, I guess, this can, change towards a requirement soon. But, this also gave a incentive from the demand side of the labor market, and then people from the supply side also, there's an incentive to stay in the labor force, and there's a shortage of workers, changes in the industrial structure. So that combined led to this shift in the labor force participation. So that's good, but participation rate cannot exceed 100%. And Japan already has a very, very high participation rate compared to other, for example, OECD countries. The participation rate is already super high. So we cannot expect the participation rate to keep increasing going forward. So what's going to be critical, from now on is to extract more productivity. So we should try to tap underutilized workforce more effectively. That's going to be the essential thing to do going forward, especially women. So participation rates of women in Japan is actually very high, much higher than the OECD average, but women's earnings are so much lower than men's earnings. So that's what's behind the notorious gender gap that we have in Japan. So according to the World Economic Forum of 2024, the gender gap is ranked 118 out of 146 countries. So we are far behind all OECD countries and many, the growing Asian countries as well. And then this is mainly driven by the, huge gap that remains in the economic participation and the political participation. So in terms of two other indicators about the education and the health, women are very good in Japan. So a lot of, educated, healthy women are not really participating in a meaningful way in terms of the economic and political areas. So I will talk about more on this later, but there are, some policies that can be blamed for this number as well. So I'll keep that for the later slides. And then for older individuals as well, I mean, not just, be happy about the increase in the participation, but we should also consider whether their resources are used effectively. So as you probably experience, maybe over the last 3-4 years, there has been a huge development in the technology, AI, ChatGPT, which I use every day. So, in 5 years, probably what I know is going to be obsolete, and I have to keep updating my skills. Otherwise, I'm going to be lost. So you have to, keep reskilling old people, young people as well. And, we should also utilize their skills that they have accumulated in an efficient way. So some, the labor market mobilities or the efficient allocation of older individuals will be very, critical as well. And policy should not be such that, these, for example, the earnings test or the tax system are going to distort the incentives of the old people. So when you think about the tax structure or the policies, we have to be careful about how people are going to respond to these changes. So older people or women are known to respond a lot more to the changes in the economic environment or the taxes. So-called labor supply elasticity is very high for these people. For younger men, they're going to work no matter what the taxes are, so the distortions will be relatively small. But the older people, women, tend to respond a lot more to fiscal systems. So we have to be very careful about implementing the reform, because people are going to change the behavior, and then you don't want to bring about unintended consequences. So in terms of women's participation, as I said, the participation rate is really high, 73%, much higher than the OECD average of 61%. And as I said, education levels are comparable to men. Both men and women have the college graduation rate of about 60% now, but the earnings are so much lower than them. And one issue is about the various, disincentives, which are, very subtly embedded in the fiscal system. So I'm going to talk about these, some small, regulations which are embedded in the current social security system. So there's spousal tax deductions, as well as exemptions from the social insurance taxes and the survivors benefits. So those are the benefits provided for, the dependent spouses whose income do not exceed a certain threshold. So back in 1960s or maybe 50s, it was not a norm that women leave the labor force once they get married and have kids, typically, 2 kids, and they stay out of the labor force many years, and then maybe they come back as a part-time worker. At that time, women's earnings were so low, and the government also wanted to provide some benefits for supporting, hardworking husband. So these policies worked quite well, especially, for women who have very low income or no jobs. They don't have any social security contributions. What can I do? And the government, they don't even have the income so that they can contribute to the system. So they gave this special exemptions from the contribution. We pay now, as we saw, very high taxes on the social security and long-term care health insurance system. But these are, this exemption makes the payment basically free. So this worked quite well, but now, these policies are standing as an essentially a tax or the obstacles for women to increase, the labor force participation. Because once you reach this threshold, you're going to all of a sudden lose these exemptions, or your husband is going to lose the spousal tax deductions, and then they have to pay a large tax if your earnings are going to exceed a certain threshold. So it is essentially, working as the income tax. So we jointly with Minamo Mikoshiba, my co-author, we examined the effect of these policies, focusing on the women's behavior who were born in 1960s, and then tried to quantify the effects of these policies. So here, this picture shows the women's labor force participation rate for a particular cohort. So the earlier picture that I showed was the cross-section picture, but this one is about the, the behavior of the particular cohort of women. And as you can, 20 minutes. So as you can see, the participation rate was quite high in the 20s, but then it declines and then it starts to pick up. Right? So that's the typical pattern that we saw before. But if you look at the composition of the work, it's quite interesting. The picture on the right shows that if you divide the work into so-called the regular jobs and the contingent job, in Japanese, it's called the seiki no shigoto to hiseiki no shigoto. But it's not really the full-time and the part-time, but there's the two-tier labor market system in Japan. So when you find a job, it is either regular or contingent. So the regular jobs pay typically more, and the jobs are much more stable. But the contingent job includes the part-time job, the contracted workers, short-term work, and when there's a the recession or COVID shock, those are the workers who get laid off quickly. So firms use the contingent workers as the the way to make an adjustment to the business cycles. But when women come back to the labor force, it's not the original regular job, but typically they try to find a job on a contingent market. What is the issue about that? So there's a huge difference in terms of the earnings. So this picture shows the earnings by age for women who take the regular job or contingent job. Also dividing the number of samples into two skill levels. So high skill, means the women with a college degree or above, and the low skill means that people who do not have the college degree. So as you can see, there's a huge inequality among women, but the big inequality lies not between the skill level, but between the the type of the jobs that they assume. So in the US and other countries, there's typically a huge inequality between the skill level, but that's not the case among Japanese women. So even if you have a college degree, as long as you take the contingent job, you can't really expect the increase in the earnings, and you're going to be basically stuck at that low earnings level. So what we did in the simulation exercise in another paper is what's going to happen, what would have happened to these women if we did not have the three, policies that are meant to, support low-income dependent women. So if we remove these three policies, what we find is that the women would start to, participate more, and then their earnings are going to be actually much higher by as much as 30%. So the key, finding out of this, simulation exercise is that the more women will start to choose the regular job, and then they're going to start to build a human capital over the life cycle, and they enjoy higher earnings throughout life. So this is the picture on the left shows the participation rates of women from age 25 to 50. So the blue line is a baseline simulation as consistent with the data. But if you remove all these, the low special, policies, we would, expect the participation rate to be much higher. So the black line represents the case where there's no such benefits, spousal reduction or the premium exemption or the survivor benefits. And then what's also surprising is the picture on the right. So the average earnings would be much higher, but the slope of the earnings will be much steeper. So women will start to stay in a regular job, and then they accumulate the human capital over the life cycle. So they can enjoy, the more growth of their earnings, and then enjoy the higher human capital throughout the life cycle. So it's not simply, the change in the participation, but how, women contribute to the labor force, what kind of jobs that they take will be very critical in thinking about their contribution in the labor force. So the productivity, so it's sort of going back to the macroeconomic challenge, but it's not simply, we shouldn't be just happy about the high participation rate, but we should be very careful about the, the productivity enhancement, and then, continuously scrutinize whether, old policies, which worked quite well back in the old days, may be distorting incentives and then creating inefficient resource allocations. Okay, so that's the main topics that I wanted to discuss. But as I said, demographic aging is going to affect, other aspects of the macroeconomy. For example, consumption. So the picture on the top right shows the total consumption profile by age. And it is known that the consumption profile looks like a hump shaped, meaning that when people are younger, their income is low, so the consumption is lower. But as you become 40 years old, 50 years old, your family grows, your consumption is going to be higher. And then once you retire, your consumption tends to go down. So by simply looking at this consumption picture, it also has the big implication about how the demographic aging will affect the aggregate consumption. But what's more interesting is that, if you look at the more composition of the consumption items, their shape really differs, and they don't really look like this hump shape. For example, if you look at the expenditures for the clothing and the footwear, that is monotonically decreasing. But if you look at the medical care and also the other care services, that's almost monotonically increasing in age. And for example, fuel, light, and water charges, that's also increasing in age. So as people retire, they spend more time at home, so that also increases the utility cost. So by looking at all these details by age, you can think about, what's going to happen to the demand for goods in different sectors as demographic aging going on, and which sector may, be forced to shrink because of the decreasing number of younger people. And that's also an interesting thing to look at. And in terms of the economic inequality, this is not such a big issue in Japan compared to, for example, in the US, where there's a huge and increasing economic inequality, but it's a growing issue in Japan as well. But what you have to be careful about is that if you just look at the sort of a macro level inequality, that tends to increase in age, which may not be necessarily a bad thing. So as you can see in the picture on the right, this picture shows the earnings inequality by age, represented by the so-called Gini coefficient. That's the coefficient that shows the degree of inequality, which increases to 1 if the economic inequality increases. And as you can see, this inequality increases in age. So when people graduate from college, I mean, there may be some difference, but the difference is not that big. But, as we see a lot of difference in maybe the efforts or the luck, the inequality tends to increase. And then by the time they reach their, the 50s or 60s, some people start to reduce work hours, or some people become super affluent executives maybe, and then other people may start to leave the labor force, so the inequality tends to increase. So if you just compute the inequality across all individuals, aging demographic implies an increase in the inequality. But that's just because of the, the change in composition of the, the demographic structure. What you should be more worried about, especially in the case of Japan, is that you can see that the inequality at younger ages, for example, at age 35, 39, that has been increasing. So that's something else that you should be worried about. So looking at the data carefully by age and also at the macroeconomic level, and what you would get will be a very important thing to keep in mind. So I didn't also talk about the immigration, but sometimes, if you have a lack of, young people, why don't we just, open the door and then import, more workers from abroad? So, that seems to be an important issue in Japan as well, but we should also keep in mind that the demographic aging is a phenomenon that is happening almost everywhere. And especially, there's a huge increase in the demand for the high-skilled workers, not just in Japan, but also in other countries as well. So I wouldn't be too optimistic about, our ability to increase the number of immigrants, although, there's a lot more room for Japan to welcome more, workers that we need. But yeah, it's not going to be the resolution of the demographic issues that we are facing. So also just a couple of slides. So about the monetary policy. So last week I attended a very interesting conference at the Bank of Korea where I discussed this paper written by Bewley and other co-authors about the effects of the monetary policy in using the life cycle model. So monetary policy, as you know, is about the changes in the interest rate and how much money to print to the economy to stimulate economic activities. And then you may consider that it has nothing to do with the demographic aging. This is really a macro policy. But they argued that we should also be concerned about the demographic structure as well. So typically, when the economy is in a bad shape, the central bank wants to reduce the interest rate so that firm is going to find the financing cost low, and the people find it's easier to borrow, and then they start to invest or they buy houses and so on, and the economy will come back to normal. But for other people, if retired people are getting income from saving, the lower return implies that the retirement income is going to be lower, right? So if the retirement income is going to be lower, what you'd have to do is instead of consuming a lot more, you have to save more. So aging demographic may actually reduce the power of the interest rate tools that the central bank can use. So even though they try to reduce the interest rate, print more money, stimulate the economy, that can actually lead to different consequences because of the changes in the asset demand, which I thought was very interesting. So that's the kind of the frontier of the research. And I have to conclude with some positive tone. So there should be some, nice thing about the demographic aging. So first of all, we are living longer, so that must be a good thing. And we have much more, capacity to work. We can continue to enjoy the leisure and do nice things. So that should be a good news. And because of this, big shortage of workers, there's new labor market opportunities for older individuals. So if you want to keep on working, the jobs are there. So that must be a good news. And so given the reskilling and the reallocation that I hope will be successful, they can keep on working. So there's an interesting study by economists at the Asian Development Bank that look at the health capacity of work across different Asian countries. And then interestingly, they show that in some countries, capacity is increasing, but others are not. So, if you're interested, take a look at that. And another thing that we should be happy about is that, when you are young, you have to save for retirement, you have to spend, but at the same time, you have to save. But what about the older people? Old people don't really have to save for retirement because they're already retired. So they are consumers, right? They have, typically a good stock of wealth, and then they're looking for, different goods and services that they want to enjoy. So they have more time to leisure, to enjoy the leisure. So that can open up, the growing opportunities for different types of goods and services provided. And also, the government should invest in technology that can reduce the cost of for example, the healthcare and the long-term care services, and that should open up the demand for technology, and not just in terms of the goods and services, but also, the financial products. So, typically textbook says that, when you are young, you should invest in the equity so that you get higher return. But as you get closer to the retirement age, you should reduce the share of the equity and then invest more on the safe assets. But given that people are living so long, life expectancy of 88 or 93, for example, in Japan, there are many, many years to come. So it may be risky to just put the money in the bonds, but rather, you should try to think about the long-run investment opportunities. So that can open up, different financial products. And then I also heard from my acquaintance working at the Trust Bank in Japan. They have developed this interesting product called a single person trust, which takes care of the asset after you pass away. So I heard that there's a huge demand for this trust, and then they stopped taking orders. So although there's I think a very high price for that, there's a really nice product that can be creatively created. And of course, there's interesting products like the picture at the bottom right shows this picture of a robot that can communicate with older people. And there's more demand for maybe monitoring older people and, helping with their daily lives. So that can open up, the new market. So it's not just, the challenges, but there can be nice opportunities to come. So that's it. And thank you very much for listening. And